Figure 21, 5. Original autograph of Beethoven at work on the second movement of his Symphony No. 5. The many corrections in different colored inks and red pencils suggest the turmoil and constant evolution involved in Beethoven's creative process. Unlike Mozart, to whom finished musical ideas came quickly, Beethoven's art was a continual struggle. Bildarchiv Preußischer Kulturbesitz Art Resource, New York. Beethoven and the Beatles, breaking the rules. Parents try to teach their children the rules of behavior. Colleges and universities teach the rules of grammar, the rules of part writing in music, and the rules of civil procedure in law, for example. Ironically, when it comes time to hold up the great figures in Western arts and ideas, it is usually the rule breakers who are given a place of honor. Shakespeare broke the rules of Greek tragedy, Galileo argued that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and Einstein said that the universe was not perfectly uniform. Monet and the Impressionists defied the rules of the French Academy, and Bill Gates began his journey to revolutionize information technology by dropping out of college. Conformity and originality, it seems, may not be compatible. The two most original, creative forces in 19th-century classical music and 20th-century popular music, respectively, were Beethoven and the Beatles. While this may seem an odd pairing, each was a revolutionary force able to take music in a new direction by challenging authority, or at least by defying the authority of tradition. Think of all the radical things that Beethoven did with the symphony and the symphony orchestra, doubled the traditional length of movements, pushed against the wall of form by greatly expanding the coda, brought in new instruments, mixed musical genres, and invented the holistic symphony by recalling the themes of earlier movements in the last movement. For each of these iconoclastic acts, an analog can be found in the work of the Beatles. They doubled the length of the traditional 3-minute pop song and sometimes greatly extended the coda, mixed genres, by bringing a string quartet or a Broadway chorus into a song. Added instruments not part of the usual rock band, and crafted a relationship among all the tracks of an album, thereby creating the concept album. Such originality requires stepping outside the box of artistic convention. If society doesn't recognize your radical position and come to value your vision, you are merely a prophet crying in a wilderness, or worse, a lunatic. If it does, you're a genius. Your rules become the new rules, the ruling standard until the next creative genius comes along. Third movement. In the classical period, the third movement of a symphony or quartet was usually a graceful minuet and trio. Haydn and his pupil Beethoven wanted to infuse this third movement with more life and energy, so they often wrote a faster, more rollicking piece and called it a scherzo, meaning joke. And while there is nothing particularly humorous about the mysterious and sometimes threatening sound of the scherzo of Beethoven's Symphony No. 5, it is certainly far removed from the elegant world of the courtly minuet. The formal plan of Beethoven's scherzo, ABA, derives from the ternary form of the minuet, as does its triple meter. The scherzo, A, is in the tonic key of C minor, while the trio, B, is in C major. The conflict of major and minor, dark and light, is one of several that are resolved in the course of this four-movement symphony. Figure 21, 6. Interior of the Theater in der Wien, Vienna, where Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 premiered on December 22, 1808. This all-Beethoven concert lasted 4 hours, from 6:30 until 10:30 p.m., and presented 8 new works, including his Symphony No. 5. During the performance of the symphony, the orchestra sometimes halted because of the difficulties in playing Beethoven's radically new music. Notice the horses on stage. Beethoven lived during a time of transition, when theaters were used for both public spectacles and music-only concerts. Copyright Art Archive Museum der Stadt Wien Alfredo Dagli Orti. Now, a stroke of genius on Beethoven's part, he links the third and fourth movements by means of a musical bridge. Holding a single pitch as quietly as possible, the violins create an eerie sound, while the timpani beats menacingly in the background. A three-note motive grows from the violins and is repeated over and over as a wave of sound begins to swell from the orchestra. Here Beethoven is concerned only with volume, not melody, rhythm, or harmony. With enormous force, the wave finally crashes down, and from it emerges the triumphant beginning of the fourth movement, one of the grandest special effects in all of music. Fourth movement. When Beethoven arrived at the finale, he was faced with a nearly impossible task. The last movement of a symphony had traditionally been a light send-off. How to write a conclusion that would relieve the tension of the preceding musical events, yet provide an appropriate, substantive balance to the weighty first movement. To this end, he created a finale that is longer and beefier than the first movement. To bulk up his orchestra, Beethoven adds 3 trombones, a contrabassoon, and a piccolo, the first time any of these instruments had been called for in a symphony. He also writes big, bold, and, in most cases, triadic themes, assigning these most often to the powerful brasses. In these instruments and themes, we hear the heroic Beethoven at his best. The finale projects a feeling of affirmation, a sense that superhuman will has triumphed over adversity. Beethoven's Symphony No. 5 reveals his genius in a paradox. From minimal material, he derives maximum sonority. Climaxes are achieved by incessantly repeating the cell-like motive. Long crescendos swell like tidal waves of sound. Wildly different moods are accommodated within a single movement. In the quiet string music of the Andante, for example, we are never far from a heroic brass fanfare. Everywhere there is a feeling of raw, elemental power propelled by the newly enlarged orchestra. Beethoven was the first to recognize that massive sound could be a potent psychological weapon. No wonder that during World War II both sides, fascist as well as Allied, used the music of this symphony to symbolize victory. The final years. By 1814, Beethoven had lost his hearing entirely and had withdrawn from society. His music, too, took on a more remote, inaccessible quality, placing heavy demands on performer and audience alike. In these late works, Beethoven requires the listener to connect musical ideas over long spans of time, to engage in long-term listening. This is music that seems intended not for the audience of Beethoven's day, but rather for future generations. Most of Beethoven's late works are piano sonatas and string quartets, intimate, introspective chamber music. But 2 pieces, the Mass in D and the Symphony No. 9, are large-scale compositions for full orchestra and chorus. In these latter works, Beethoven strives once again to communicate directly to a broad spectrum of humanity. Download a supplementary listening guide for Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, fourth movement, at the text website. Beethoven's Symphony No. 9, his last, was the first symphony in the history of music to include a chorus. Here the composer's desire for expression was so great that the instruments of the orchestra alone were no longer sufficient. To make his message obvious to all, Beethoven needed something more, text and voices. The text, Und die Freude by poet Friedrich von Schiller, is a hymn in honor of universal brotherhood, a theme that had been important to Beethoven since his earliest years. Beethoven worked on the melody for this poem, on and off, for nearly 20 years. The melody and text are given on page 31. The melody serves as the basis of listening exercise 5 and can be heard on 8. Ultimately, Beethoven brought his setting of Ode to Joy into the last movement of his last symphony, where it provides a theme for a magnificent set of variations. For 25 minutes, the music marches toward a grand climax. Beethoven pushes the voices to sing louder and louder, higher and higher, faster than they can enunciate the text. The instrumentalists, too, are driven by the presto tempo to go so quickly they can scarcely play the notes. All performers strain to exceed the limits of their physical abilities and accomplish the impossible. The sound is not so much beautiful as it is overwhelming, for the chorus and orchestra speak with one exalted voice. Their message is Beethoven's message: art will unify all humanity. Figure 21, 7. A drawing of the deceased Beethoven sketched on the morning of March 28, 1827, the day after the composer's death. It was made by Joseph Danhauser, the same artist who painted the group portrait that appears on the cover of this book. The Cobby Collection Trust, UK. The Bridgeman Art Library. Epilogue, Beethoven and the 19th Century. the figure of Beethoven towered over all the arts during the 19th century. He had shown how personal expression might expand the confines of classical form with astonishingly powerful results. He had given music the grand gesture, stunning effects like the crashing introduction of the pathetic sonata or the gigantic crescendo leading to the finale of the Fifth Symphony. He had shown that pure sound divorced from melody and rhythm, could be glorious in and of itself. At once he had made music both grandiose and intensely lyrical. His works became the standard against which composers of the Romantic era measured their worth. The painting shown on the cover of this book depicts Franz Liszt at the piano. A bust of Beethoven, larger than life, gazes down at him from Olympian heights, a monument to all that is noble and sublime in art. A complete checklist of musical style for the classical period can be found at the text website. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lectures at Open Yale courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: pathetic, sonata, Heiligenstadt, Testament, heroic, period, eroica, symphony, ode to joy. Part 5, Romanticism, 1820-1900. AKG, Berlin Superstock. 22 Introduction to Romanticism. 23 Romantic Music, the Art Song. 24 Romantic Music, Program Music and Ballet. 25 Romantic Music, Piano Music. 26 Romantic Opera, Italy. 27 Romantic Opera, Germany. 28 19th century realistic opera. 29 Music and Nationalism. 30 Late Romantic orchestral music. The Romantic era was a period in which artists aspired to go beyond the mundane, to the world of the imagination and of dreams. Belief in rational inquiry, an article of faith of the Enlightenment, began to wane. Reason gave way to passion, and objective evaluation to subjective emotion. The Romantics began to see the sublime in art and, most sublime of all, in nature herself. Poets, painters, and musicians depicted surging rivers and thunderous storms in their respective media. Love, too, became an important theme. Indeed, from the word romance, we derive the term romantic. But the romantic vision also had its dark side. And these same artists expressed a fascination with the occult, the supernatural, and the macabre. This was the age not only of Felix Mendelssohn's playful overture to A Midsummer Night's Dream but also of Mary Shelley's chilling Frankenstein. What was music in the Romantic era? To critic Charles Burney, writing in 1776, music was an innocent luxury, unnecessary, indeed, to our existence. But to Beethoven, writing in 1812, music was the most important of the arts that would raise men to the level of gods. Clearly, the very concept of music, its purpose and meaning, had undergone a profound change in these 36 years. No longer seen merely as entertainment, music now could point the way to previously unexplored realms of the spirit. Beethoven led the way, and many others, Berlioz, Wagner, and Brahms among them, followed in his footsteps. When the German author E.T.A. Hoffmann wrote that Beethoven's Fifth Symphony releases the floodgates of fear, of terror, of horror, of pain, and arouses that longing for the eternal which is the essence of Romanticism, he prophesied for much romantic music to come. 22 Introduction to Romanticism. The mature music of Beethoven, with its powerful crescendos, pounding chords, and grand gestures, announces the arrival of the Romantic era in music. The transition from musical classicism to Romanticism in the early 19th century coincides with similar stylistic changes in the novels, plays, poetry, and paintings of the period. In all the arts, revolutionary sentiments were in the air: a new desire for liberty, bold action, passionate feeling, and individual expression. Just as the impatient Beethoven finally cast off the wigs and powdered hair of the 18th century, many other Romantic artists gradually cast aside the formal constraints of the older classical style. Romantic inspiration, romantic creativity. Romanticism is often defined as a revolt against the classical adherence to reason and rules. Whereas artists of the 18th century sought to achieve unity, order, and a balance of form and content, those of the 19th century sought self-expression, striving to communicate with passion no matter what imbalance might result. If classical artists drew inspiration from the monuments of ancient Greece and Rome, those of the Romantic era looked to the human imagination and the wonders of nature. The Romantic artist exalted instinctive feelings, not those of the masses, but individual, personal ones. As the American Romantic poet Walt Whitman said, "I celebrate myself, and sing myself." If a single feeling or sentiment pervaded the Romantic era, it was love. Indeed, romance is at the very heart of the word romantic. The loves of Romeo and Juliet, and Tristan and Isolde, for example, captured the public's imagination in the Romantic era. The endless pursuit of love, the search for the unattainable, became an obsession that, when expressed as music, produced the sounds of longing and yearning heard in so much of Romantic music. Figure 22, 1. The balcony scene of Romeo and Juliet by Eugene Delacroix typifies the 19th century fascination with love and with Shakespeare. Berlioz sought to capture the spirit of the play in a 5-movement program symphony. Tchaikovsky tried to do so in a 1-movement symphonic poem. Copyright AKG, Berlin Superstock. Yet love was only one of several emotions dear to the Romantics. Despair, frenzy, and heavenly exaltation were others expressed in music and poetry. Just how the range of expression was broadened in Romantic music can be seen in the expression marks that came into being at this time: espressivo, dolente, presto furioso, con forza e passione, misterioso, and maestoso. Not only do these directives explain to the performer how a passage ought to be played, they also reveal what the composer wished to express through music. Romantic musicians eloquently expressed their feelings about nature. As Beethoven proclaimed in 1821, "I perform most faithfully the duties that humanity, God, and nature enjoin upon me." In his Pastoral Symphony, the first important Romantic nature piece, Beethoven seeks to capture both nature's tranquil beauty and its destructive fury. Schubert's Trout Quintet, Schumann's Forest Scenes, and Strauss's Alpine Symphony are just a few of the many musical works that continue the tradition. Associated with this desire to be at one with nature was a passion for travel, what the Germans called a Wanderlust. Far-off places and people fired the Romantic imagination. The German composer Felix Mendelssohn journeyed to Italy, Scotland, and the Hebrides Islands to find inspiration for his symphonies and overtures. The English poet Lord Byron sailed to Greece and Turkey and infused his art with a sense of travel and adventure. Figure 22, 2. Man and Woman Gazing at the Moon, by German Romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich. The painting projects a sense not only of isolation and a contemplation of nature but also of the slow, evolutionary progress of geological time. Copyright Bildarchiv Preußischer Kulturbesitz Art Resource, New York. The musician as artist, music as art. With the Romantic era came the idea that music was something more than mere entertainment and that the composer was more than a hired employee. Bach had been a municipal civil servant, devoted and dutiful, in the town of Leipzig. Haydn and Mozart had served and been treated as domestics in the homes of the great lords of Europe. But Beethoven began to break the chains of submission. He was the first to demand, and receive, the respect and admiration due a great creative spirit. Ultimately, Franz Liszt and Richard Wagner, as much through their literary works as their musical compositions, caused the public to view the artist as a sort of demigod, a prophet able to inspire audiences through the creation of music that was both morally uplifting and beautiful. To the artist is entrusted the upbringing of mankind, said Liszt. Never was the position of the creative musician loftier than in the mid-19th century. Just as the musician was elevated from servant to artist, so the music he or she produced was transformed from entertainment to art. Classical music had been created for the immediate gratification of patron and audience, with little thought given to its lasting value. With the mature Beethoven and the early Romantics, this attitude began to change. Symphonies, quartets, and piano sonatas sprang to life, not to give immediate pleasure to listeners, but to satisfy a deep-seated creative urge within the composer. They became extensions of the artist's inner personality. These works might not be understood by the creator's contemporaries, as was true of the late piano sonatas of Beethoven and the orchestral works of Hector Berlioz, for example, but they would be understood by posterity, by future generations of listeners. The idea of art for art's sake, art free of all immediate functional concerns, was born of the Romantic spirit. The newly exalted position of the composer in his art soon brought a more serious tone to the concert hall. Prior to 1800, a concert was as much a social event as a musical experience. People talked, drank, ate, played cards, flirted, and wandered about. Dogs ran freely on the ground floor, and armed guards roamed the theater to maintain at least some order. When people turned to the music, they were loud and demonstrative. They hummed along with the melody and tapped the beat to the music they liked. If a performance went well, people applauded, not only at the ends of the pieces but also between movements. Sometimes they demanded an immediate encore, other times they hissed their disapproval. Shelley and the Romantic poets. Just as Romantic music is thought to be the emotional core of classical music generally, so the English Romantic poets are commonly seen as the heart and soul of poetry in the English language. George Gordon Lord Byron and Percy Bysshe Shelley led prototypically excessive romantic lives. Byron had an affair with his half-sister, swam the Hellespont, and died, at 36, fighting for Greek national independence. Shelley was expelled from Oxford, abandoned his first wife, and ran off with Mary Godwin. In the summer of 1816, Percy and Mary Shelley, along with best friend Byron, lived as neighbors in the Swiss Alps, where, as an evening entertainment, she conceived her Gothic novel Frankenstein. Ultimately, Percy Shelley died at age 30 while sailing on the Italian coast. Shelley's poem, Love's Philosophy, unites the two most powerful forces of the Romantic aesthetic, nature and romance. The fountains mingle with the river and the rivers with the ocean, the winds of heaven mix forever with a sweet emotion, nothing in the world is single. Mary Godwin and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Copyright Russell Coates Art Gallery and Museum, Bournemouth, UK. The Bridgeman Art Library. Copyright Stock Montage Super Stock. All things by a law divine in one spirit meet and mingle. Why not I with thine? See the mountains kiss high heaven and the waves clasp one another, no sister flower would be forgiven if it disdained its brother, and the sunlight clasps the earth and the moonbeams kiss the sea. What is all this sweet work worth if thou kiss not me? Around 1840, however, a sudden hush came over the concert hall, it became more like a church or temple. With the revered figure of the Romantic artist-composer now before them, the members of the audience sat in respectful silence. A concert-goer who was not distracted socially became a listener who was engaged emotionally. More was expected of the audience, because symphonies and sonatas were longer and more complex. But the audience, in turn, expected more from the music, not just entertainment, but an emotionally satisfying encounter that would leave the attentive listener exhausted yet somehow purified and uplifted by the artistic experience. The painting on the cover of this book, from 1840, suggests how the Romantic imagination wrapped even secular music in a sacred aura. We see a temple of art, the artists are the congregants, Liszt the high priest, the piano the altar, and Beethoven the god. Romantic ideals and today's concert hall. Romanticism has kept its grip on the Western imagination. Belief in the artist as hero, reverence toward the work of art as an object of moral inspiration, and the expectations of silence and even formal dress at a concert, all of these attitudes developed in the early Romantic period. What is more, the notion that a particular group of pieces merited repeated hearings gained currency at this time. Prior to 1800, almost all music was disposable music. It was written as entertainment for the moment and was then forgotten. But the generation following Beethoven began to see his best symphonies, concertos, and quartets, as well as those of Mozart and Haydn, as worthy of preservation and repeated performance. These and the best works of succeeding generations came to form a canon, indeed a museum, of classical music, and they constitute the core of today's concert repertoire. Thus, what we think about the composer, how we view the work of art, what we can expect to hear at a concert, and even how we dress and behave during the performance are not eternal ideals, with us since time immemorial, but are instead values created during the Romantic period. In many respects, the attitudes about art and music that arose in the early 19th century still govern our thinking today. The style of Romantic music. The Romantic spirit rebelled against classical ideals in ways that allow us to generalize these two artistic movements in terms of opposites: rational against irrational, intellect opposed to heart, conformity versus originality, and the masses in contradistinction to the individual. Yet in purely musical terms, the works of the Romantic composers represent not so much a revolution against classical ideals as an evolution beyond them. The classical genres of the symphony, concerto, string quartet, piano sonata, and opera remain fashionable, though somewhat altered in shape, throughout the 19th century. The symphony now grows in length, embodying the widest possible range of expression, while the concerto becomes increasingly virtuosic, as a heroic soloist does battle against an orchestral mass. The Romantics introduced no new musical forms and only two new genres, the art song and the symphonic poem. Instead, Romantic composers took the musical materials received from Haydn, Mozart, and the young Beethoven and made them more intensely expressive, more personal, more colorful, and, in some cases, more bizarre. Romantic melody. The Romantic period witnessed the apotheosis of melody. Melodies became broad, powerful streams of sound intended to sweep the listener away. They went beyond the neat symmetrical units inherent in the classical style, becoming longer, rhythmically more flexible, and more irregular in shape. At the same time, Romantic melodies continued a trend that had developed in the late 18th century, in which themes became vocal in conception, more singable or lyrical. Countless melodies of Schubert, Chopin, and Tchaikovsky have been turned into popular songs and movie themes. Romantic music is perfectly suited for the romance of film, because these melodies are so profoundly expressive. They sigh, lament, grow, and wax ecstatic. They start haltingly and then build to a grandiose climax, sublime and triumphant. Example 22:1 shows the well-known love theme from Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet. As the brackets show, it rises and falls, only to rise higher again, a total of 7 times, on the way to a fortissimo climax. Example 22:1. Colorful harmony. Part of the emotional intensity of Romantic music was generated by a new, more colorful harmony. Classical music had, in the main, made use of chords built upon only the 7 notes of the major or minor scale. Romantic composers went further by creating chromatic harmony, constructing chords on the 5 additional notes within the full 12-note chromatic scale. This gave more colors to their harmonic palette, allowing the rich, lush sounds we associate with Romantic music. Chromatic harmony likewise encouraged bold chordal shifts. A chord with 3 sharps might be followed immediately by one with 6 flats, for example. The striking sound that results from these unusual juxtapositions is harmonious with music that seeks to express a wider range of feeling. Finally, 19th-century composers gave a romantic feel to music by means of dissonance. Longing, pain, and suffering traditionally have been expressed in music by dissonance. All musical dissonance, so the rules of composition say, must resolve to consonance. The longer the painful dissonance, the greater the desire for resolution. A delay of the resolution intensifies the feelings of anxiety, longing, and searching, all sentiments appropriate to music that often deals with the subject of love. All 3 of these qualities of romantic harmony, chromatic harmony, bold chordal shifts, and prolonged dissonance, can be heard in Frédéric Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor. Neither you nor the author can take in all the music given in the following 3 examples simply by looking at them. We can, however, visualize here some of the music's inner workings: first the bold harmonic shift from a chord with 4 sharps to one with 4 flats, then the chromaticism, and finally the prolonged dissonance. In this way, we may begin to understand, when hearing the rich, sensuous sound of romantic music, how it is created. Example 22, 2, bold harmonic shift at 240. Example 22, 3, chromatic harmony at 320. Example 22, 4, prolonged dissonance at 505. Romantic tempo, rubato. In keeping with an age that glorified personal freedom and tolerated eccentric behavior, tempo in romantic music was cut loose from the restraints of a regular beat. The watchword here was rubato, an expression mark for the performer written into the score by the composer. A performer playing tempo rubato stole some time here and gave it back there, moving faster or slower so as to effect an intensely personal performance. The free approach to tempo was often reinforced by fluctuating dynamic levels, retards were executed with diminuendos, and accelerations with crescendos, as a way of explaining, even exaggerating, the flow of the music. Whatever excesses might result could be excused under license of artistic freedom. Romantic forms, monumental and miniature. The musical forms that had worked earlier for Haydn and Mozart during the classical period continued to satisfy the needs of the 19th century composer. Sonata, allegro form, in particular, remained useful because its flexible format could accommodate any number of individual solutions. What developed, then, was not a rush to invent new forms but a trend toward elongating existing ones. Music that expresses longing by definition takes more time. As composers laid out broad and sweeping melodies, indulged in gigantic crescendos, and reveled in the luxurious sound of the enlarged orchestra, the length of individual movements increased dramatically. Mozart's G minor symphony lasts about 20 minutes, depending on the tempo of the conductor. But Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique takes nearly 55 minutes, and Mahler's Symphony No. 2 nearly an hour and a half. Perhaps the longest of all musical works is Richard Wagner's four-opera Ring Cycle, which runs some 17 hours over the course of 4 evenings. Romantic musicians were not alone in their extended vision. Charles Darwin posited that the Earth was not merely 7,000 years old, as the Bible suggested, but several million. Painters such as J. M. W. Turner and Caspar David Friedrich demonstrated on canvas the slow, inexorable evolution of the Earth. Friedrich, by including in his painting dying and fallen trees, as well as depicting clear geological strata to show the passing of the ages. The grand, slow gestures we hear in the symphonies of Beethoven, Brahms, and Mahler are all part of the expansive spirit of the age. Yet, paradoxically, Romantic composers were not interested only in the grandiose, the miniature fascinated them as well. In works of only a brief minute or two, they tried to capture the essence of a single mood, sentiment, or emotion. Such a miniature was called a character piece. It was usually written for the piano and often made use of simple binary or ternary form. Because the character piece passes by in a twinkling of an eye, it was sometimes given a whimsical title, such as bagatelle, humoresque, arabesque, musical moment, caprice, romance, intermezzo, or impromptu. Schubert, Schumann, Chopin, Liszt, Brahms, and Tchaikovsky all enjoyed creating these musical miniatures, perhaps as antidotes to their lengthy symphonies and concertos. Watch a video of Craig Wright's Open Yale Course Class Session 20, The Colossal Symphony, Beethoven, Berlioz, Mahler, and Shostakovich, at the text website. Expressive tone colors, greater size, greater volume. Perhaps the most striking aspects of Romantic music are the color and sheer volume of the sound. Sometimes all thematic and harmonic movement stops, and nothing but pure sound remains. Appropriate to an age that indulged in wild mood swings, Romantic composers prescribed greater dynamic extremes. Whereas the range in classical music extended only from pp to ff, now exaggerated hypermarks such as pppp and fffff appear. To create sounds as loud as fffff, a larger orchestra or a bigger piano was needed. Composers demanded, and received, musical forces equal to the task of expressing the emotional extremes, changing moods, and extravagant gestures of the Romantic spirit. Figure 22, 3. A modern French horn with valves, an invention of the 1820s. The valves allow the performer to engage different lengths of tubing instantly, and thereby play a fully chromatic scale. Copyright Bob Jacobson Corbis. The Romantic Orchestra. Technology has sometimes profoundly affected the history of music. Think, for instance, of the invention of the electrically amplified guitar, which revolutionized the orchestra or band that accompanied 20th-century popular and rock songs. The Romantic era witnessed a comparable change in the orchestra. Significantly, it coincided with the Industrial Revolution, which produced new or technologically enhanced musical instruments of every sort. The wood of the flute was replaced by silver, and the instrument was supplied with a new fingering mechanism that added to its agility and made it easier to play in tune. Similarly, the trumpet and French horn were provided with valves that improved technical facility and accuracy of pitch in all keys. These brass instruments were now capable of playing intricate, chromatic melodies, as well as providing the traditional backdrop of sonic support for the rest of the orchestra. The French horn, in particular, became an object of special affection during the Romantic period. Its rich, dark tone and its traditional association with the hunt, and by extension, nature, made it the romantic instrument par excellence. Composers often called on a solo horn to express something mysterious or distant. Besides improvements to existing instruments, several new instruments were added to the symphony orchestra during the 19th century. We have seen how Beethoven brought the piccolo, the trombone, and the contrabassoon into the orchestra in his famous Symphony No. 5. In 1830, Hector Berlioz went even further, requiring an ophicleide, an English horn, a cornet, and 2 harps in his Symphonie Fantastique. Berlioz, the embodiment of the Romantic spirit, had a typically grandiose notion of what the ideal symphony orchestra should contain. He wanted no fewer than 467 instruments, including 120 violins, 40 violas, 45 cellos, 35 double basses, and 30 harps. Such a gigantic instrumental force was never actually assembled, but Berlioz's utopian vision indicates the direction in which Romantic composers were headed. By the second half of the 19th century, orchestras with nearly 100 players were not uncommon. Compare, for example, the number and variety of instruments required for a typical 18th century performance of Mozart's symphony in G minor with the symphony orchestra needed for Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique and for Gustav Mahler's Symphony No. 1. By the end of the 19th century, the symphony orchestra had become, in almost all ways, the ensemble of instruments that we see today. Figure 22.4. A large orchestra depicted at Covent Garden Theatre, London, in 1846. The conductor stands toward the middle, baton in hand, with strings to his right and woodwinds, brass, and percussion to his left. It was typical in this period to put all or part of the orchestra on risers to allow the sound to project more fully. Art resource. Our reaction to the Romantic orchestra today, however, is very different from the response in the 19th century. Our modern ears have been desensitized by an overexposure to electronically amplified sound. But imagine the impact of an orchestra of 100 players before the days of amplification. Apart from the military cannon and the steam engine, the 19th century orchestra produced the loudest sonic level of any human contrivance. The big sound, and the big contrasts, of the 19th century orchestra were new and startling, and audiences packed ever larger concert halls to hear them. The conductor. Naturally, someone was needed to coordinate the efforts of the enlarged orchestra. Previously, in the days of Bach and Mozart, the orchestra had been led from within, either by the keyboard player of the basso continuo, gesturing with his head and hands, or by the chief violinist, directing with his bow. When Beethoven played and conducted his piano concertos, he did so seated at his instrument. When he led one of his symphonies, especially toward the end of his life, he stood before the orchestra, back to the audience, waving his hands. In 1820, the composer Louis Barre became the first to use a wooden baton to lead the orchestra. Other objects were used as well, including a rolled-up piece of paper, a violin bow, and sometimes even a handkerchief. As symphony orchestras became larger and symphonic scores more complex, every orchestral ensemble needed a leader to keep it from falling apart during performance. In the course of the 19th century, this leader evolved from a mere time beater into an interpreter, and sometimes a dictator, of the musical score. The modern conductor had arrived. Figure 22, 5. Silhouette of composer Carl Maria von Weber conducting with a rolled sheet of music so as to highlight the movement of his hand. Lebrecht Music and Arts. The growth of the symphony orchestra. The virtuoso. Appropriate for an era that glorified the individual, the 19th century was the age of the solo virtuoso. Of course, there had been instrumental virtuosos before, Bach on the organ and Mozart on the piano, to name just two, but now, many musicians began to expend enormous energy striving to raise their performing skills to unprecedented heights. Pianists and violinists in particular spent long hours practicing technical exercises, arpeggios, tremolos, trills, and scales played in thirds, sixths, and octaves, to develop wizard-like hand speed on their instrument. Naturally, some of what they played for the public was lacking in musical substance, tasteless showpieces designed to appeal immediately to the audiences that packed the ever larger concert halls. Pianists even developed tricks to make it seem as if they had more than two hands. Franz Liszt sometimes played at the keyboard with a lighted cigar between his fingers. The Italian Niccolò Paganini secretly tuned the four strings of his violin in ways that would allow him to negotiate with ease extraordinarily difficult passages. If one of his strings broke, he could play with just three; if three broke, he continued apace with just one. So great was his celebrity that Paganini's picture appeared on napkins, ties, pipes, billiard cues, and powder boxes. As a composer later remarked, the attraction of the virtuoso is like that of the circus performer, there's always the hope that something disastrous will happen. The daredevil quality of Paganini's virtuosic music can be seen in example 22-5, which looks something like a roller coaster. Fortunately, as we shall see, some of these performing daredevils were also gifted composers. Figures 22-6 and 22-7. Niccolò Paganini. Paganini sleeping while the devil teaches him to play the violin. Paganini's extraordinary powers on the violin led some to believe that he had made a deal with the devil. The highest string of his violin was said to be made of the intestine of his mistress, whom he had murdered with his own hands. None of this was true, and Paganini filed several libel suits to reclaim his honor. Corbis. Copyright Interfoto Alami. Example 22-5, Paganini, Caprice, Opus 1, No. 5. Coda. While this introduction to musical romanticism treats the major developments of the 19th century, there were others. The increased attention paid to literature in the Romantic era inspired new musical genres, the art song, the program symphony, and the related symphonic poem. The technological innovations that fostered the development of the large symphony orchestra also led to the fabrication of a much larger and more powerful piano, as well as a musical literature specifically for it. Finally, political events, which led to the creation of modern nations such as Germany and Italy, caused musical reverberations in the form of new, nationalistic musical styles. All of these developments, the art song, program music, the romantic piano, and musical nationalism, will be discussed in the following chapters. Listening exercise 29. Comparing orchestral works of the classical and romantic periods. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. The transition from the classical to the romantic period witnessed a great enlargement of the resources available to a symphonic composer, and this expansion resulted in significant changes in musical style. To appreciate the extent of this change, let's compare two orchestral works, the first movement of Mozart's Symphony No. 40 in G minor and the finale of Hector Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. Listen to the first 4 minutes of each work and answer the following questions, indicating M for Mozart or B for Berlioz. If you need help, consult the listening guides on pages 192 and 259, 260. 1. which composer begins with pure musical atmosphere, much as in a score for a modern-day motion picture? 2. Which composer begins with a clear-cut pair of four-bar antecedent, consequent phrases? 3. Which composer exhibits greater mood swings, in which the music oscillates between louds and softs, and high pitches and low pitches? 4. Which composer designates a brass instrument and a percussion instrument to play the melody? 5. Which composer requires the violins to present all themes at first appearance? 6. Which composer maintains a steady beat throughout? 7. Which composer maintains a constant tempo throughout? 8. Accordingly, the work of which composer is more likely to need a conductor during performance, owing to the lack of a clearly audible beat and consistent tempo? 9. Which composer drew inspiration for his symphony from events outside of music? 10. Which composer had to have a compelling melody because he didn't have the orchestral resources to achieve startling special effects? The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may watch Craig Wright's own lecture at Open Yale Courses and complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: canon, chromatic harmony, rubato, character, piece, virtuoso. 23. Romantic music, the art song. The decade 1803-1813 was perhaps the most auspicious in the history of Western music. In this short span of time were born the composers Hector Berlioz, Felix Mendelssohn, Frédéric Chopin, Robert Schumann, Franz Liszt, Giuseppe Verdi, and Richard Wagner. Add to these the shining figure of Franz Schubert, and this brilliant galaxy of romantic musical geniuses is complete. We call them romantics because they were part of, indeed, they created, the Romantic movement in music. Perhaps not surprisingly, they were very unconventional people. Their lives typify all that we have come to associate with the Romantic spirit: self-expression, passion, excess, and the love of nature and literature, as well as a certain selfishness and irresponsibility, and even a bit of lunacy. Not only did they create great art, but life, and how they lived it, also became an art. The art song. One of the hallmarks of the Romantic era was a quickening interest in literature, especially poetry. Indeed, never were word and tone more closely allied than during the Romantic era. The Romantic poets viewed music as the truest and purest of all the arts, owing to the abstract quality of sound. Composers, in turn, found musical resonance in the poetry of the day and transformed it into song, believing that music could intensify poetic sentiments by expressing things that words alone could not. Songs inspired by great poetry have appeared throughout human history. But the near frenzy of poetic activity in the 19th century inspired Romantic composers to set poems to music with increasing frequency. The English Romantic poets William Wordsworth, John Keats, Lord Byron, and Percy Bysshe Shelley, who burst onto the scene in the early 1800s, had German counterparts not only in the great Johann von Goethe but also in the younger Romantics Joseph von Eichendorff and Heinrich Heine. Literally thousands of odes, sonnets, ballads, and romances poured from their pens, and many were quickly set as songs by young Romantic composers. In so doing, these musicians popularized a genre called the art song, a song for solo voice and piano accompaniment with high artistic aspirations. Because the art song was cultivated most intensely in German-speaking lands, it is also called the Lied, German for song. Although many composers wrote art songs, none had greater success in the genre than Franz Schubert. His special talent was to fashion music that captured both the spirit and the detail of the text, creating a sensitive mood painting in which the voice, and especially the accompanying piano, expresses every nuance of the poem. Schubert said, "When one has a good poem, the music comes easily, melodies just flow, so that composing is a real joy." Franz Schubert. Franz Schubert was born in Vienna in 1797. Among the great Viennese masters, Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Brahms, and Mahler, only he was native-born to the city. Schubert's father was a schoolteacher, and the son, too, was groomed for that profession. Yet the boy's obvious musical talent made it imperative that he also have music lessons, so his father taught him to play the violin, and his older brother the piano. At the age of 11, Schubert was admitted as a choir boy in the Emperor's Chapel. Proximity to the royal palace brought young Schubert into contact with Antonio Salieri, erstwhile rival of Mozart and still imperial court composer. Schubert began to study composition with Salieri in 1810 and was soon composing his own musical works at an astonishing rate. After his voice changed in 1812, young Franz left the court chapel and enrolled in a teacher's college. He had been spared compulsory military service because he was below the minimum height of 5 feet and his sight was so poor that he was compelled to wear the spectacles now familiar from his portraits. By 1815, he had become a teacher at his father's primary school. But he found teaching demanding and tedious, and so after 3 unpleasant years, Schubert quit his day job to give himself over wholly to music. You lucky fellow, I really envy you. You live a life of sweet, precious freedom, can give free rein to your musical genius, can express your thoughts in any way you like. This was Schubert's brother's view of the composer's newfound freedom. But as many romantics would find, the reality was harsher than the ideal. Aside from some small income he earned from the sale of a few songs, he lacked financial support. Schubert, unlike Beethoven, had no circle of aristocrats to provide patronage. Consequently, he lived a vagabond life, helped along by the generosity of his friends, with whom he often lodged when he was broke. He spent his mornings passionately composing music, passed his afternoons in cafes discussing literature and politics, and often spent his evenings performing his songs and dances for friends and admirers. Figures 23:1 and 23:2. Franz Schubert. A small, private assembly known as a Schubertschied, named after the composer, at which artists presented their works. The singer before the piano is Johann Vogel, accompanied by Schubert at the piano. Copyright Wien Museum Karlsplatz, Vienna. The Bridgman Art Library. As Schubert was reaching artistic maturity, the era of the great aristocratic salon was drawing to an end, its role as a primary venue for artistic expression replaced by the middle-class parlor or living room. Here, in less formal surroundings, groups of men and women with a common interest in music, the novel, drama, or poetry would meet to read and discuss the latest developments in these arts. The gatherings at which Schubert appeared, and at which only his compositions were played, were called Schubertschieds by his friends. It was in small, purely private assemblies such as these, not in large public concerts, that most of his best songs were first performed. In 1822, disaster befell the composer. He contracted syphilis, a venereal disease tantamount to a death sentence before the discovery of antibiotics. His lyrical symphony in B minor of that year, appropriately called the Unfinished Symphony, was left incomplete. Yet during the years that preceded his premature death in 1828, Schubert created some of his greatest work: the song cycles Die Schoenmüllerin and Winterreise, the Wanderer, Fantasy for piano, and the Great C Major Symphony. When Beethoven died in 1827, Schubert served as a torchbearer at the funeral. The next year he, too, was dead, the youngest of the great composers. The epitaph for his tombstone reads, "The art of music here entombed a rich treasure, but even fairer hopes." In his brief life of 31 years, Franz Schubert wrote 8 symphonies, 15 string quartets, 21 piano sonatas, 7 masses for chorus and orchestra, and 4 operas, a sizable oeuvre by any standard. Yet in his day, Schubert was known almost exclusively as a writer of art songs. Indeed, he composed more than 600 works in this genre, many of them minor masterpieces. In a few cases, Schubert chose to set several texts together in a series. In so doing, he created what is called a song cycle, a tightly structured group of individual songs that tell a story or treat a single theme. Die Schoenmüllerin and Winterreise, both of which relate the sad consequences of unrequited love, are Schubert's 2 great song cycles. Erlnig. To get an idea of Schubert's precocious musical talent, We need only listen to his song Erlkönig, written when he was just 17. The text itself is a ballad, a dramatic story told alternately in narrative verse and in dialogue, from the pen of the famous German poet Goethe. It relates the tale of the evil king of the elves and his malevolent seduction of a young boy. Legend had it that whoever was touched by the king of the elves would die. This tale typifies the romantic fascination with the supernatural and the macabre, which is evinced most famously in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. According to a friend's account, Schubert was reading a book of Goethe's poetry, pacing back and forth. Suddenly, he sprang to a piano and, as fast as he could write, set Goethe's entire ballad to music. From there, Schubert and his friend hastened to the composer's college to play it for a few other friends. In his lifetime, Erlkönig became Schubert's best-known song, and one of only a few that earned him any money. The opening line of the poem sets the frightening nocturnal scene: "Who rides so late through night and wind?" With his feverish son cradled in his arms, a father rides at breakneck speed to an inn in an attempt to save the child. Schubert captures both the general sense of terror in the scene and the detail of the galloping horse. He creates an accompanying figure in the piano that pounds on relentlessly just as fast as the pianist can make it go. Figure 23:3. The Ballad of the Elf King depicted by Schubert's close friend Moritz von Schwind. The artist had heard Schubert perform the song at many Schubertschades. Copyright Bildarchiv Preußischer Kulturbesitz Art Resource, New York. Example 23:1. The specter of death, the Elf King, beckons gently to the boy. He does so in seductively sweet tones, in a melody with the gentle lilt and folksy, pa accompaniment of a popular tune. Example 23:2. The frightened boy cries out to his father in an agitated line that culminates in a tense, chromatic assent. Example 23:3. This cry is heard again and again in the course of the song, each time at a successively higher pitch and with increasingly dissonant harmonies. In this way, the music mirrors the boy's growing terror. The father tries to calm him in low tones that are steady, stable, and repetitive. The Elf King at first charms in sweet, consonant tones, but then threatens in dissonant ones, as seduction gives way to abduction. Thus each of the three characters of the story is portrayed with distinct musical qualities. This is musical characterization at its finest. The melody and accompaniment not only support the text but also intensify and enrich it. Suddenly, the end is reached, the hand of the Elf King has touched his victim. Anxiety gives way to sorrow as the narrator announces in increasingly somber tones, but in his arms, his child was dead. Begin exploring how this art song by Schubert can be interpreted in very different ways by different performers, in the YouTube playlist on the text website. Listening Exercise 30. Schubert Erlkönig. 3:14-129. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Schubert was a master at bringing to life the essential characters and sentiments of the poetry he set to music. This exercise suggests how he used two very basic musical elements, a shift in mode and a change in the accompaniment, to intensify Goethe's dramatic ballad Erlkönig. 1. The opening section presents rapidly repeating notes in the right hand of the accompanist and an ominous motive below in the left. In which mode is the introduction written? A. Major B, minor. 2. When the Elf King enters, is the ominous motive still heard in the accompaniment? A. Yes B, no. 3. In which mode does the Elf King sing? A. Major B, minor. 4. As the sun re-enters, what happens in the piano accompaniment? As rapidly repeating notes return in the accompanist's right hand, and the mode shifts from major to minor. B. Rapidly repeating notes return in the accompanist's left hand, and the mode shifts from minor to major. 5. For the second appearance of the Elf King, which is true? A. The rapidly repeating notes in the right hand continue, and the mode is minor. B. Arpeggios replace the rapidly repeating notes in the right hand, and the mode is major. 6. for the third and final appearance of the Elf King, which is true. A. The accompaniment pattern changes to arpeggios in the right hand, and the mode remains a happy major throughout. B. The repeating notes in the right hand continue, and toward the end, the mode changes abruptly from major to minor. 7. How does Schubert emphatically emphasize that the child has died and that there will be no happy ending? A. He writes an abrupt V.I cadence in a major key. B. He writes an abrupt V.I cadence in a minor key. 8. Excluding the narrator, how many characters are portrayed in Schubert's Erlkönig? A. 1b, 2c, 3. 9. How many voices actually sing the Lied in performance? A. 1b, 2c, 3d, 4. 10. What must any singer bring to a performance of this art song if it is to be successful? A. The ability to sing like a horse. B. The ability to project a range of voices and styles, almost like an impersonator. C. The ability to bring a single interpretive mood to the song. Just as the tension in Goethe's poem rises incessantly, from the beginning to the very end, Schubert's music unfolds continually, without significant repetition. Such a musical composition featuring ever-changing melodic and harmonic material is called through-composed, and Schubert's Erlkönig, accordingly, is termed a through-composed art song. For texts that do not tell a story or project a series of changing moods, however, strophic form is often preferred. Here a single poetic mood is maintained from one stanza, or strophe, of the text to the next. Most pop songs are written in strophic form, each strophe consisting of a verse and chorus. For a very familiar example of a 19th-century art song in strophic form, revisit the famous Brahms lullaby. Robert Schumann. While some art songs, such as Schubert's Erlkönig, were musical arrangements of dramatic ballads, most were settings of lyrical love poems. The subject of love dominates not only Schubert's Lieder but also those of Robert and Clara Schumann, whose conjugal life story is itself something of an ode to love. Robert Schumann was born not to music but to literature. His father was a novelist who introduced him to romantic poetry and the ancient classics. But the father died young, and Robert's mother determined that her son should take a safe route to prosperity, study law. Reluctantly, Schumann matriculated at the University of Heidelberg, but he attended not a single class, preferring to pass the time with poetry and music. In 1830, determined to become a virtuoso, Schumann moved, with his mother's grudging consent, to Leipzig. But after 2 years of lessons with the eminent Friedrich Wieck, during which he practiced 7 hours a day, all he had to show for his labors was a permanently damaged right hand, so he turned his attention to music criticism and composition. Figure 23, 4. Robert and Clara Schumann in 1850, from an engraving constructed from an early photograph. Copyright Bettman Corbis. While studying piano with Wieck, Schumann met and fell in love with Wieck's beautiful and talented daughter Clara. Her father vehemently opposed the union, however, and Robert perforce began a legal battle to win Clara's hand. One of Wieck's objections was that Schumann could not support himself, let alone a wife. Inspired by his love of Clara, and perhaps motivated to show that he could earn a living, Schumann turned to writing art songs, then probably the most marketable of musical genres. In 1840, Robert won a legal victory over Clara's father, enabling the couple to marry. That same year, Schumann composed nearly 125 Lieder, including settings of poems by major Romantic poets such as Byron, Goethe, and Friedrich Ruckert, as well as a few by Shakespeare. Download supplementary listening guides for Robert Schumann's Im wunderschönen Monat Mai, und Wussens die Blumen die Kleinen, and Die Alten, Bossen Lieder, from Dieterlieb, at the text website. The day Robert Schumann won his court victory for the hand of Clara, he wrote in his diary, "Happiest day and end of the struggle." In this euphoric mood, he completed a setting of 8 poems by the German Romantic poet Adalbert von Chamisso that speak of the hopes and desires of a young middle-class woman. Titled Frauenliebe und Leben, the 8 poems form a unit, moving from the theme of love at first sight, to engagement, to painful separation. Thus the 8 collectively form a song cycle. Most of the 8 Schumann settings are in modified strophic form. In the middle of the cycle, however, comes Du Ring and meinem Finger, a 5-strophe poem in which the newly betrothed gazes starstruck at her ring. Because strophe 3 is similar to, and strophe 5 identical with, strophe 1, here Schumann chose not to opt for a strophic form setting but to give the song an Abeka musical form, providing identical music for similar stanzas. The climax comes in strophe C, in which the young voice climbs up the scale excitedly as she professes her undying love. Composure returns with the repeat of the lyrical refrain A, which is followed by a soft piano epilogue. Clara Wieck Schumann. Unlike her husband, Robert, a gifted composer but failed performer, Clara Wieck Schumann. See Figure 23-4 was one of the great piano virtuosos of the 19th century. A child prodigy, she made her debut at the age of 11 in Leipzig, Germany, the city of her birth. She then undertook a concert tour of Europe during which she impressed and befriended several important composers of the Romantic era, including Mendelssohn, Berlioz, Chopin, and Liszt. In Austria, the emperor named her Royal and Imperial Chamber Virtuosa, the first time that official title had been given to a Protestant, a teenager, or a woman. When she married Robert Schumann in 1840, Clara was an international star, and Robert an unknown. Nevertheless, she took up the dual roles of wife to Robert and mother to the 8 children she soon bore him. She, too, tried her hand at musical composition, writing mostly art songs and character pieces for piano. But despite her unmistakable talent as a composer, Clara was ambivalent about the capacity of women, herself included, to excel as creative artists. As her children grew more numerous, her compositions became fewer. Clara's most productive period as a composer of art songs coincided with the very early years of marriage to Robert. Download a supplementary listening guide for Clara Schumann, Der Mond kommt still gegangen, at the text website. Clara's Liebst du Schönheit makes a lovely companion piece to husband Robert's Du Ring and meinem Finger. Composed in 1841, a year after her marriage, Clara's Liebst du Schönheit is a setting of a 4-stanza love poem by Joseph Eichendorff. In this wistful, playful text, the poet sets forth 3 reasons why the lady should not be loved, not for beauty, youth, or money, but one for which she should be loved, for love alone. Although the melodic and accompanimental figures presented in the first strophe prevail in the subsequent ones, Clara varies the musical setting on each occasion, producing modified strophic form, in this case represented as AAAA. Example 23-4 shows the melody of strophe 1 and how it is modified in strophe 2. The ever-evolving music gives this art song its remarkable freshness. Did Clara equal or surpass Robert as a composer of lieder? You be the judge. Where were the women? You may have noticed that female composers are poorly represented in this book. We have seen the works of some, Hildegard of Bingen and Barbara Strozzi, for example, and we will meet those of Ellen Tofts-Willich later. But in general, although women have been actively engaged as performers of secular music since the Middle Ages, only rarely, prior to the 20th century, did they become composers. While the reasons for this are numerous, one stands out above all others: people then had no faith in the capacity, or the propriety, of female creativity. Although a young lady might learn to play the piano in a show of domestic refinement, the woman's function in society was defined as nurturer of children and handmaiden of husband. Fanny Mendelssohn Hensel, the gifted sister of composer Felix Mendelssohn, was 15 and considering music as a profession when she received the following directive in a letter from her father: "What you wrote to me about your musical occupations, and in comparison to those of Felix, was rightly thought and expressed. But though music will perhaps become his profession, for you it can and must only be an ornament, never the core of your existence. You must become more steady and collected, and prepare yourself for your real calling, the only calling for a young woman, the state of a housewife." Fanny Mendelssohn in 1829, in a sketch by her husband-to-be, Wilhelm Hensel. Copyright Mary Evans Picture Library. The Image Works. With no encouragement to become a creative force outside the home, little wonder that self-doubt arose among women of talent. As Clara Schumann wrote in her diary in 1839, "I once believed that I possessed creative talent, but I have given up this idea. A woman must not desire to compose. There has never yet been one able to do it. Should I expect to be that one?" Composing a symphony or a string quartet is a complex process requiring years of schooling in harmony, counterpoint, and instrumentation. Women did not have access to such formal training in composition. For example, the Paris Conservatory was founded in 1793 but did not admit women into classes in advanced music theory and composition until almost a century later. Women might study piano, but according to a decree of the 1820s, they were to enter and leave by a separate door. Only in those exceptional cases in which a daughter received an intense musical education at home, as did Fanny Mendelssohn and Clara Schumann, did a woman have a fighting chance to become a musical creator. Example 23:4. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Who is the best songwriter of recent times, John Lennon, Bob Dylan, Andrew Lloyd Webber, or Elton John? Difficult to say. Who was the best art song composer of the 19th century? We have now heard 4 art songs by 4 different composers, Schubert and the 2 Schumanns in this chapter, and Johannes Brahms, a protégé of the Schumanns, in chapter 6. The following exercise asks you to think about how the 4 songs were fashioned and how they compare. 1. Which of the 4 songs is composed in strophic form? A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. 2. Which is in modified strophic form? A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. 3. Which is in rondo form? A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. 4. Which is through composed? A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. 5. Which of the 4 is the most dramatic and least lyrical? A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. 6. Knowing that many pop songs are strophic, which art song is closest to a pop song? A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's. C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. 7. All of these great songs were written by young people, but which one was written by a teenager? A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. 8. True or false? Judging from these 4 works, a piano accompaniment is a traditional part of the 19th century art song, just as is the guitar for a pop song today. A. True. B. False. 9. Judging from the texts of these 4 works, the 19th century art song was directed toward, intended to please, and sung in the homes of whom? A. The aristocracy. B. The clergy. C. The middle class. 10. Which of these 4 songs did you enjoy most? No correct answer here, but think about the reasons for your preference. A. Schubert's B. Robert Schumann's C. Clara Schumann's D. Brahms's. Lives of Tragedy and Fidelity. Robert Schumann was something of a streak composer. During the 1830s, he wrote music for solo piano almost exclusively, sonatas, variations, and character pieces. In 1840, he composed almost nothing but art songs. In 1841, he wrote 2 of his 4 symphonies, and in 1842, he turned his attention to chamber music, which culminated in a highly regarded piano quintet. The year 1845 saw the composition of the brilliant piano concerto in A minor, but after that his creative output diminished. From his earliest years, Robert Schumann had been afflicted with what psychiatrists now call bipolar disorder. His moods swung from nervous euphoria to suicidal depression. In some years, he produced a torrent of music, in others, virtually nothing. As time progressed, Schumann's condition worsened. He began to hear voices, both heavenly and hellish, and one morning, pursued by demons within, he jumped off a bridge into the Rhine River. Nearby fishermen pulled him to safety, but from then on, by his own request, he was confined to an asylum, where he died of dementia in 1856. Clara Schumann outlived Robert by 40 years. She raised the children, and to pay the bills, she resumed her career as a touring piano virtuoso. Dressed in mourning black, she played across Europe into the 1890s. After Robert's death, Clara never composed again and never remarried. Proving that life sometimes imitates art, Clara remained true to the pledge made in her song, Liebst du, Schönheit, I will love you eternally. Today they rest side by side in a small cemetery in Bonn, Germany, two souls exemplifying the spirit of the Romantic Age. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: Art song Lied Schubert'sche song cycle through composed strophic form modified strophic form. 24 Romantic music program music and ballet. The romantic love of literature stimulated interest not only in the art song but also in program music. Indeed, the 19th century can fairly be called the century of program music. True, there had been earlier isolated examples of program music, in Vivaldi's The Seasons, for example. But Romantic composers believed that music could be more than pure, abstract sound, that music alone could tell a story. Program music is instrumental music, usually written for symphony orchestra, that seeks to recreate in sound the events and emotions portrayed in some extra-musical source, a story, legend, play, novel, or even historical event. The theory of program music rests on the obvious fact that specific musical gestures can evoke particular feelings and associations. A lyrical melody may spur memories of love, harshly dissonant chords might imply conflict, or a sudden trumpet call may suggest the arrival of the hero, for example. By stringing together such musical gestures in a convincing sequence, a composer might tell a story through music. Program music is fully harmonious with the strongly literary spirit of the 19th century. Some Romantic composers, notably Johannes Brahms, resisted the allure of program music and continued to write what came to be called absolute music, symphonies, sonatas, quartets, and other instrumental music without extra musical or programmatic references. Most others, however, desiring to convey a clear, coherent message, took advantage of the more overtly narrative character of program music. In 1850, Franz Liszt, a leading advocate of program music, said that a program gave the composer a means by which to protect the listener against a wrong poetical interpretation and to direct his attention to the poetical idea of the whole. Three of the predominant genres of program music, the program symphony, dramatic overture, and concert overture, were created simply by applying programs to the previously abstract genres of the symphony and overture. A fourth, the symphonic poem, was entirely new to the 19th century. Program symphony, a symphony with the usual 3, 4, or 5 movements, which together depict a succession of specific events or scenes drawn from an extra musical story or event. Examples include Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique and Liszt's Faust Symphony. Dramatic overture, a one-movement work, usually in sonata, allegro form, that encapsulates in music the essential dramatic events of an opera or play. Many overtures became audience favorites and are today performed at concerts without the opera or play. Examples include Rossini's overture to his opera William Tell and Mendelssohn's overture to Shakespeare's play A Midsummer Night's Dream. Concert overture, a one-movement work of programmatic content originally intended for the concert hall. Examples include Tchaikovsky's The 1812 Overture and Mendelssohn's Hebrides Overture. Tone poem, a one-movement work for orchestra that gives musical expression to the emotions and events associated with a story, play, political event, or personal experience. Examples include Tchaikovsky's Romeo and Juliet, Mussorgsky's Night on Bald Mountain, and Strauss's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In fact, there is little difference between the tone poem and the concert overture. Both are one-movement orchestral works with programmatic content intended for the concert hall. Two of the best composers of descriptive music were Hector Berlioz and Peter Tchaikovsky. Hector Berlioz and the Program Symphony. Hector Berlioz was one of the most original figures in the history of music. He was born in 1803 near the mountain city of Grenoble, France, the son of a local doctor. As a youth, Berlioz studied mainly the sciences and ancient Roman literature. Although local tutors taught him to play the flute and guitar, he had no systematic training in music theory or composition and little exposure to the music of the great masters. Among the major composers of the 19th century, he was the only one without fluency at the keyboard. He never studied piano and could do no more than bang out a few chords, yet he would become one of the greatest orchestrators of all time. At the age of 17, Berlioz was sent off to Paris to study medicine, his father's profession. For 2 years, he pursued a program in the physical sciences, earning a degree in 1821. But Berlioz found the reality of the dissecting table repulsive and the allure of the opera house and concert hall irresistible. After a period of soul-searching, and the inevitable falling out with his parents over the choice of a career, he vowed to become no doctor or apothecary but a great composer. His dismayed father immediately cut off his living stipend, leaving young Berlioz to ponder how he might support himself while studying composition at the Paris Conservatory. Other composers had relied on teaching as a means to earn a regular income, but Berlioz, with no particular skill at any instrument, was not qualified to give music lessons. Instead, he turned to music criticism, writing reviews and articles for literary journals. Berlioz was the first composer to earn a livelihood as a music critic, and it was criticism, not composition, that remained his primary source of income for the rest of his life. Figure 24, 1. Hector Berlioz at the age of 29. Copyright Scala Art Resource, New York. Perhaps it was inevitable that Berlioz would turn to writing about music, for in his mind, there was always a connection between music and the written word. As a young man, he read Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage and Goethe's Faust, works that inspired his viola concerto Harold in Italy and his dramatic symphony The Damnation of Faust. But of all literary influences, none was greater than that of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's dramas first burst upon the literary scene of continental Europe early in the 19th century. For Berlioz, the experience was life-altering. Shakespeare, coming upon me unawares, struck me like a thunderbolt. The lightning flash of that discovery revealed to me at a stroke the whole heaven of art. Berlioz devoured Shakespeare's plays and based musical compositions on 4 of them: The Tempest, King Lear, Hamlet, and Romeo and Juliet. The best known of Berlioz's tributes to the bard, Romeo and Juliet, is a 5-movement program symphony in which a chorus and solo voices intermittently paraphrase Shakespeare's own words. The common denominator in the art of Shakespeare and Berlioz is range of expression. Just as no dramatist before Shakespeare had portrayed the full spectrum of human emotions on the stage, so no composer before Berlioz had undertaken to create the widest range of moods through sound. To depict wild swings of mood musically, Berlioz called for enormous orchestral and choral forces, hundreds and hundreds of performers. Figure 24-2. He also experimented with new instruments, the ophicleide, the English horn, the harp, the cornet, and even the newly invented saxophone. In 1843, he wrote a treatise on musical instruments, one still used today as a textbook in orchestration classes at music conservatories around the world. Berlioz's approach to musical form was equally iconoclastic and forward-looking. He rarely used such standard forms as sonata, allegro, or theme and variations. Instead, he preferred to create forms that flowed from the particular narrative of the story at hand. His French compatriots called his compositions bizarre and monstrous, and thought him something of a madman. Subscribing to the adage, "No man is a prophet in his own land," Berlioz took his progressive music to London, Vienna, Prague, and even Moscow, introducing such works as Symphonie Fantastique, Damnation of Faust, and Romeo et Juliet. He died in Paris in 1869, isolated and embittered, the little recognition he received in his native France having come too late to boost his career or self-esteem. Figure 24, 2. A caricature of Berlioz conducting in mid-19th century Paris, in what became known as monster concerts because of the huge forces the composer required. Berlioz would have liked several hundred performers for the premiere of his Symphonie Fantastique in 1830, but the printed program suggests that he had to settle for about 100. Archives Charmet the Bridgman Art Library. Symphonie Fantastique. Berlioz's most celebrated work, then and now, is his Symphonie Fantastique, perhaps the single most radical example of musical romanticism. Its form and orchestration are revolutionary. But what is more, it tells in music a vivid story and, as such, is the first complete program symphony. The story surrounding the creation of the descriptive program of the work is as fascinating as the piece itself. In 1827, a troupe of English actors came to Paris to present Shakespeare's Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. Berlioz, of course, had read some of Shakespeare's plays in French translation, but he was eager to see these works performed on stage. Though he understood little English, he was overwhelmed by what he saw. The human insights, touching beauty, and on-stage action in Shakespeare's work far surpassed the virtues found in traditional French theatre. Not only was Berlioz smitten by Shakespeare, he also fell in love with the leading lady who played Ophelia to Hamlet and Juliet to Romeo, one Harriet Smithson. Like a lovesick adolescent, Berlioz swooned at her sight and wrote such violently passionate letters that the frightened starlet refused even to meet the student composer. Eventually, his ardor cooled. For a time, he even became engaged to someone else. But the experience of an all-consuming love, the despair of rejection, and the vision of darkness and possible death furnished the stimulus and story line for an unusually imaginative symphony. Figure 24, 3. The actress Harriet Smithson became an obsession for Berlioz and the source of inspiration for his Symphonie Fantastique. Eventually, Berlioz did meet and marry Smithson. Today they lie side by side in the cemetery of Montmartre in Paris. Copyright Yale Center for British Art. Copyright the Bridgman Art Library. Berlioz composed his Symphonie Fantastique in 5 movements instead of the usual 4, an arrangement that may have been inspired by Shakespeare's use of a 5-act format. Movements 1 and 5 balance each other in length and substance, as do 2 and 4, leaving the leisurely third movement as the center of the work. But symmetry is not the only element holding the symphony together. Berlioz creates a single melody that reappears as a unifying force, movement after movement, a total of 8 times during the symphony. This melody, which represents the protagonist's beloved within the story, became, like Harriet Smithson, the composer's obsession. Berlioz called this musical fixation his idée fixe. As the protagonist's feelings about his beloved change from movement to movement, so the idée fixe is transformed. The composer alters the pitches, changes the rhythm, and assigns the theme to different instruments, each of which adds its own tone, color, and feeling. To make sure the listener knows what these feelings are, Berlioz prepared a written program to be read as the music was performed. It tells the story of unrequited love, attempted suicide, imaginary murder, and hellish revenge. First movement, reveries, passions. Program, a young musician sees for the first time a woman who embodies all the charms of the ideal being he has imagined in his dreams. The subject of the first movement is the passage from this state of melancholy reverie, interrupted by a few moments of joy, to that of delirious passion, with movements of fury, jealousy, and its return to tenderness, tears, and religious consolation. A slow introduction prepares the way for the first vision of the beloved, who is represented by the first appearance of the main theme, the idée fixe. Example 24, 1. The movement unfolds in something akin to sonata, allegro form. The recapitulation, however, does not so much repeat the idée fixe as transform the melody to reflect the artist's feelings of sorrow and tenderness. Second movement, a ball. The artist finds himself in the midst of the tumult of a party. A lilting waltz now begins, but it is interrupted by the unexpected appearance of the idée fixe, its rhythm changed to accommodate the triple meter of the waltz. 4 harps add a graceful accompaniment when the waltz returns, and toward the end, there is even a lovely solo for cornet. The sequence of waltz, idée fixe, waltz creates ternary form. Third movement, scene in the country. Finding himself one evening in the country, the artist hears in the distance 2 shepherds piping. He reflects upon his isolation and hopes that soon he will no longer be alone. The dialogue between the shepherds is presented by an English horn and an oboe, the latter played offstage to give the effect of a distant response. The unexpected appearance of the idée fixe in the woodwind suggests that the artist has hopes of winning his beloved. But has she falsely encouraged him? The shepherd's tune recurs, but the oboe doesn't respond. In response to the lonely petition of the English horn, we now hear only the rumble of distant thunder in the timpani. The call for love goes unanswered. Fourth movement, march to the scaffold. Having realized that his love goes unrecognized, the artist poisons himself with opium. The dose of the narcotic, too weak to kill him, plunges him into a sleep accompanied by the most horrible visions. He dreams that he has killed the one he loved, that he is condemned, led to the scaffold, and now witnesses his own execution. This drug-induced nightmare centers on the march to the scaffold ere the artist is to be executed. The steady beat of the low strings and the muffled bass drum sound the steps of the procession. Near the end, the image of the beloved returns in the clarinet, only to be suddenly cut off by a fortissimo crash by the full orchestra. The guillotine has fallen. Figure 24, 4. Witches' Sabbath by Francisco de Goya bears the same title as the finale of Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique. Both create images of the bizarre and macabre so dear to the hearts of romantic artists. Girardin, the Bridgman Art Library. Fifth movement, Dream of the Witches' Sabbath. He sees himself at the witches' Sabbath surrounded by a troop of frightful shadows, sorcerers, and monsters of all sorts, gathered for his funeral. Strange noises, groans, bursts of laughter, distant cries echoed by others. The beloved melody returns again, but it has lost its noble, modest character and is now only base, trivial, and grotesque. An outburst of joy at her arrival, she joins in the devilish orgy. In this monstrous finale, Berlioz creates his personal vision of hell. A crowd of witches and other ghouls is summoned to dance around the corpse of the artist on its way to the inferno. Eerie sounds are produced by the strings, using mutes, and by the high woodwinds and French horn, playing glissandos. A piercing clarinet enters with a horrid parody of the idée fixe as Harriet Smith's son, now in the frightful garb of a wicked old hag, comes on stage. Example 24, 2. Download a supplementary listening guide for Berlioz, Symphonie Fantastique, 4th movement, at the text website. She is greeted by a joyous fortissimo outburst by the full assembly as all proceed to dance to the now perverted idée fixe. Suddenly, the music becomes ominously quiet, and in one of the most strikingly original moments in all of classical music, great Gothic church bells are heard. Against this solemn backdrop sounds the burial hymn of the medieval church, the Dies Irae, played by ophicleides and bassoons. Example 24, 3. Not only is the orchestration sensational, the musical symbolism is sacrilegious. Just as the painter Goya parodies the Catholic Mass in his Witches' Sabbath, making babies serve as communion wafers, so Berlioz creates a mockery of one of the most venerable Gregorian chants of the Catholic Church. First, the Dies Irae is played by the horns twice as fast. Then the sacred melody is transformed into a jazzed-up dance tune played by a shrill, high clarinet, the entire scene now becoming a blasphemous black mass. Example 24, 4. As the ceremony proceeds, the witches begin to dance. But they do so in a strange way. They enter one by one and create a fugato, a fugal passage within a symphonic movement. This successive entry of more and more voices, or dancing witches, creates the effect of a growing tumult around the corpse of the artist. Example 24, 5. A climax is reached as the witch's theme, or subject, played by the strings, as well as the Dies Irae melody, played by the brasses and woodwinds, sound together in different keys, a bizarre example of double counterpoint. Stranger still is the sound that follows, for Berlioz instructs the violins to play col legno, to strike the strings, not with the usual front of the bow, but with the wooden back, creating a noise evocative of the crackling of hellfire. To the audience that first heard the Symphonie Fantastique on December 5, 1830, all of this must have seemed incomprehensible: new instruments, novel playing effects, simultaneous melodies in different keys, and a form that is not traditional, like sonata, allegro or rondo, but grows out of the events in a thriller movie-like program. But it all works. Here again is an instance of a creator, a genius, breaking the rules and stepping outside the box of conventional art, yet he does so in a way that produces a wholly integrated, unified, and ultimately satisfying work. The separate effects may be revolutionary and momentarily shocking, but they are consistent and logical among themselves when heard within the total artistic concept. Had Berlioz never written another note of music, he would still be justly famous for this single masterpiece of romantic invention. The real end of the program. In Berlioz's programmatic Symphonie Fantastique, art imitates life. He constructs a musical narrative to mirror events in his young life. But how did the story of Berlioz and his beloved Harriet Smithson really end? In truth, Berlioz did meet and marry Harriet, but the two lived miserably together ever after. He complained about her increasing weight, she about his infidelities. Harriet died in 1854 and was buried in a small graveyard in Paris. In 1864, that cemetery was to be closed and the remains of all the deceased transferred to a new, larger burial ground. It fell to widower Berlioz to remove Harriet's corpse to the new cemetery, as he recounts in his memoirs. The Parisian painter Eugene Delacroix's depiction of the graveyard scene in Hamlet. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. One dark, gloomy morning I set forth alone for the sad spot. A municipal officer was waiting, to be present at the disinterment. The grave had already been opened, and on my arrival the gravedigger jumped in. The coffin was still entire, though it had been 10 years underground. The lid alone was injured by the damp. The man, instead of lifting it out, tore away the rotten lid, which cracked with a hideous noise, and brought the contents of the coffin to light. He then bent down, took up the crowned, decayed head of the poor Ophelia, and laid it in a new coffin awaiting it at the edge of the grave. Then, bending down a second time, he lifted with difficulty the headless trunk and limbs, a blackish mass to which the shroud still adhered, resembling a heap of pitch in a damp sack. I remember the dull sound. And the odor. Berlioz had begun by playing Romeo to Harriet's Juliet, and ended by playing Hamlet to her Ophelia. He cast his music, and his life, in terms of Shakespearean drama. Listening exercise 32. Berlioz. Symphonie Fantastique. 3:16-17. 2:1-2. To take this listening exercise online and receive feedback or email answers to your instructor, go to the text website. Imagine that you were among the audience in Paris on December 5, 1830, when Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique was first performed. If you had been a dedicated concertgoer up to that time, you might have heard one or two of the latest symphonies of Beethoven. But this would have been the extent of your exposure to radical, new music. How would you have reacted? The following set of questions asks you to focus upon several aspects of orchestration and form in this astonishingly original work. 1. The opening moments sound eerie because the high strings create special effects by means of special string techniques. What two distinctive string techniques are employed? A. First tremolo, then ostinato. B. First pizzicato, then tremolo. C. First tremolo, then pizzicato. 2. The idée fixe returns, now transformed. The passage sounds weird because of Berlioz's unusual orchestration. What do you hear? A. Idée fixe in oboe against pounding timpani. B. Idée fixe in high clarinet against pounding bass drum. 3. Among the instruments that introduced the dies irae is one that Berlioz introduced into the symphony orchestra. Which is it? A. high clarinet B, cornet C, tuba D, piccolo. 4. The French horns now play the dies irae melody twice as fast as before. What is this sort of reduction in duration in music called? A. Augmentation B, triple C, contraction D, diminution. 5. Now the fugato begins. Its structure is made clear, in part, because the composer cuts off the subject each time so as to announce the next entry. He does this by means of a burst of syncopated chords in the brasses. How many times does this occur? A. Twice B, 3 times C, 4 times. 6. Which instruments play a reminiscence of the dies irae chant? A. Cellos and double basses B, bells C, tubas. 7. Now the dies irae and the witches' dance are heard simultaneously. How are they orchestrated? A. Dies irae in violins, witches' dance in trumpets B. Dies irae in trumpets, witches' dance in violins. 8. When two independent themes or motives sound simultaneously, what process results? A. A multiple counterpoint B. Double counterpoint C. Double play. 9. As the strings produce the crackling sound by playing col legno, a melody is heard in the woodwinds. Which is it? A. The witches' dance B. The idée fixe C. The dies irae chant. 10. Having now heard a piece of romantic program music, do you think it is advantageous to have a program? What might be a disadvantage of listening to music for which there is a program? A. It is easier to get lost with program music than it is with absolute music. B. While it is easier to follow the composer's intent, your imagination is restricted. There is only one way to hear the music. Peter Tchaikovsky and the Tone Poem. The 19th century witnessed continued growth in the number and variety of instruments included in the Western Symphony Orchestra. This expansion worked to the advantage of those composers intent on writing dramatic program music for orchestra, because greater color and volume allowed for ever more dramatic expression. The most prolific writer of late 19th century program music was Peter Tchaikovsky. Figure 24, 5. Peter Tchaikovsky. Copyright Lebrick Music and Arts. Tchaikovsky was born in 1840 into an upper-middle-class family in provincial Russia. He showed a keen ear for music in his earliest years and by the age of 6 could speak fluent French and German. As to his career, his parents determined that law would provide the safest path to success. Thus, beginning in 1852, young Tchaikovsky spent 7 years at the School of Jurisprudence in St. Petersburg and 4 more years as a clerk in the Ministry of Justice. Then, like Robert Schumann before him, he realized that it was music, not law, that fired his imagination. He made his way to the St. Petersburg Conservatory of Music, from which he was graduated in 1866. That same year, he went to the newly formed Moscow Conservatory, where he assumed the position of professor of harmony and musical composition. In truth, it was not his official position in Moscow that supported Tchaikovsky during most of his mature years, but rather a private arrangement with an eccentric patroness, Madame Nadezhda von Meck. This wealthy, music-loving widow furnished him with an annual income of 6,000 rubles on the condition that she and the composer never meet, a requirement not always easily fulfilled, since the two sometimes resided at the same summer estate. In addition to this annuity, in 1881, Tsar Alexander III awarded Tchaikovsky an annual pension of 3,000 rubles in recognition of his importance to Russian cultural life. Being a man of independent means meant that Tchaikovsky not only was able to travel extensively in Western Europe, and even to America, but also could enjoy the freedom he found so necessary to creative activity. Figure 24, 6. Nadezhda von Meck was the widow of an engineer who made a fortune constructing the first railroads in Russia during the 1860s and 1870s. She used her money, in part, to support composers such as Tchaikovsky and, later, Claude Debussy. Copyright Topham The Image Works. Download a supplementary listening guide for Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture at the text website. Tchaikovsky's creative output touched every genre of 19th-century classical music, including opera, song, string quartet, piano sonata, concerto, and symphony. But today concertgoers know Tchaikovsky best for his program music and ballets. His extravagant concert overture, the 1812 Overture, which commemorates the Russian defeat of Napoleon in 1812, is heard in the United States on the 4th of July, with Tchaikovsky's musical pyrotechnics usually followed by fireworks in the night sky. Less sensational, but equally compelling, is his tone poem Romeo and Juliet. By the end of the 19th century, Tchaikovsky was the world's most popular orchestral composer, the big name, brought from Europe to America when star appeal was needed to add luster to the opening of Carnegie Hall in 1891. Despite his considerable popular success, Tchaikovsky's life was not a happy one. He was a manic depressive, a neurotic, and a hypochondriac. He was also a homosexual, and this during a time when there was little tolerance for homosexuality or awareness of its biological causes. He died suddenly in 1893, at the age of 53, after drinking unboiled water during an epidemic of cholera. Symphonic poem, Romeo and Juliet. Tchaikovsky was at his best when writing illustrative music for large orchestra, whether program music or music for ballet. He termed his most overtly programmatic works overture, overture fantasy, or symphonic fantasy. Today we group all of these in the general category of tone poem, or symphonic poem, a title suggesting the literary flavor of these one-movement, programmatic pieces. Tchaikovsky, like Berlioz before him, found that Shakespeare's plays provided the richest source of extra-musical inspiration. Of his three-tone poems based on the works of Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, The Tempest, and Hamlet, the best is Romeo and Juliet. In Romeo and Juliet, Tchaikovsky aimed to capture the spirit, not the letter, of Shakespeare's play, and thus he crafted a free, not literal, representation of its principal dramatic events. In fact, the composer distills these into just three musical themes: the compassionate music of the kindly Friar Lawrence, whose plan to unite the lovers goes fatally awry, the fighting music, which represents the feud between the Capulets and Montagues, and the love theme, which expresses the passion of Romeo and Juliet. Most important, whereas Shakespeare's drama unfolds as a continuous linear process, Tchaikovsky sets his themes within the confines of sonata, allegro form, which gives the music a recursive shape, presentation, confrontation, resolution. The introduction begins with the music of Friar Lawrence and concludes with a succession of mysterious chords strummed on a harp, as if Friar Lawrence, like a medieval bard, were about to narrate a long, tragic tale. When the exposition begins, we hear angry percussive music, racing strings, and syncopated cymbal crashes, suggesting that we have entered the violent world of the Capulets and Montagues. Soon the fighting subsides and the love theme emerges, precisely where we would expect a lyrical second theme to appear in sonata, allegro form. As appropriate for a pair of lovers, the love theme is in two parts, each of which grows and becomes more passionate when pushed upward in ascending melodic sequences. Example 24:6, Love Theme Part 1. Example 24:7, Love Theme Part 2. The brief development section pits the feuding families against the increasingly adamant pleas of Friar Lawrence. The recapitulation, true to sonata form, begins with the feud music but moves quickly to an expanded, more ecstatic presentation of the love theme, which is eventually cut off by a noisy return of the feuding clans. The beginning of the dramatic coda is announced by a foreboding fortissimo roll on the timpani. As we hear the steady drumbeats of a funeral procession and fragments of the broken love theme, we know that Romeo and Juliet are dead. A celestial, hymn-like passage suggests that the lovers have been united in some higher realm, a feeling confirmed by the return of the love theme in high violins. There only remains to bring the curtain down on the story of the star-crossed lovers, which Tchaikovsky does with 7 fortissimo hammer strokes for full orchestra, all on the tonic chord. Shakespeare wrote Romeo and Juliet as a tragedy, for never was a story of more woe than this of Juliet and her Romeo, say the final lines of the play. By incorporating a celestial conclusion into his coda, a hymn-like choir of angelic woodwinds followed by the transcendent love theme on high in the violins, Tchaikovsky has changed the final import of the play. True child of the Romantic age, he suggests that the love-death of Romeo and Juliet was, in fact, not a tragedy but a spiritual triumph. Ballet. Ballet, like opera, calls to mind high-end culture. Significantly, the origins of ballet are tied to the history of opera, for ballet emerged from a hybrid of the two genres performed at the French royal court of Louis XIV. Throughout the 18th century, no opera seria, even one by Mozart, was complete without a ballet or two to provide a pleasant diversion. By the early 19th century, however, this dance spectacle had separated from opera and moved on stage as the independent genre we know today. A ballet is thus a dramatic dance in which the characters, using various stylized steps and pantomime, tell a story. While ballet first developed in France, during the 19th century it gained great popularity, and indeed an adopted homeland, in Russia. Even today, the terms Russian and ballerina seem inextricably linked. Early in his career, Tchaikovsky realized that ballet required precisely the compositional skills that he possessed. Unlike Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven, Tchaikovsky was not a developer. He was not good at teasing out intricate thematic relationships over long spans of time. Instead, his gift was to create one striking melody and mood after another, to create one vivid scene and then move on to the next. And this is precisely what ballet music requires, not symphonic invention or contrapuntal intricacy, but short bursts of tuneful melody and captivating rhythm, all intended to capture the emotional essence of the scene. Short is the operative word here, because dancing in a ballet is exhausting. Neither the principals nor the corps de ballet hold center stage for more than 3 minutes at most. Tchaikovsky's short segment style proved perfect for the demands of ballet. From his pen flowed Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, and The Nutcracker. Arguably the three most popular works in the entire repertoire of grand romantic ballet. Figure 24, 7. A recent production of The Nutcracker by the Royal Ballet, showing a pas de deux in Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy. Robbie Jack Corbis. Who among us does not know some of the ballet music from The Nutcracker, a holiday ritual as traditional as caroling and gift-giving? The story, typical of Romantic-era narratives, springs from a fairy tale dream. After a Christmas Eve celebration, an exhausted young girl, Clara, falls asleep and sees in her imagination people from exotic places and toys come to life. Fantastical characters parade before us, not merely accompanied but literally brought to life by the music. In Dance of the Reed Pipes, piping flutes create the mood of the moment. In Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy, an instrument new to the orchestra, a keyed percussion instrument called the celesta, conjures up an appropriately elfin sound. But ballet music must not only create evocative moods, it must also project a strong, clear metrical pulse to animate, indeed, regulate, the steps of the dancers. If you can't hear the beat, you can't dance, tutu or not. Finally, it is important to keep in mind that ballet music is not program music. Program music is purely instrumental music, in which sounds alone create the narrative. In ballet music, on the other hand, music is an adjunct. The movements, facial expressions, and gestures of the dancers tell the story. The materials on the text website will help you understand and pass tests on the content of this chapter. In addition, you may complete this chapter's listening exercise interactively, as well as view active listening guides and other materials that will help you succeed in this course. Key words: program music, absolute music, program, symphony, dramatic overture, concert overture, tone, poem, Aufgekleid, English horn, cornet, idée fixe, dies irae, diminution, double counterpoint, call, legno, ballet, ballet music, celesta. 25 Romantic music, piano music. We have all banged away on a piano at one time or another. Some of us were subjected to piano lessons, with the obligatory exercises by Clementine Kramer, all accompanied by our mother's prediction, "Someday you'll thank me for this." But did you ever stop to think how the piano came to be? In brief, it was invented around 1700 as an alternative to the harpsichord, as a way of giving more dynamics and shading to the musical line. The piano assumed its modern form, the 3-pedal, 88-key 1,200-pound grand, during the Romantic period. Just as the symphony orchestra grew in size and power during the 19th century, so, too, did the piano, propelled by the new technology of the Industrial Revolution. Mozart's piano was small, and its frame was made of wood. 19th-century technology supplied the piano with a frame made of cast iron, allowing for greater tension on the strings. This cast iron frame supported thicker steel strings, which greatly increased the volume of sound and the punishment the instrument could take. But not only could the Romantic piano support louder and more aggressive playing, it also facilitated a gentler, more lyrical style. Its hammers were covered with felt, which allowed the instrument to sing with a mellow tone, in contrast to the ping of the pianos of Mozart's day. Like the growing 19th-century orchestra, the piano could now produce both a very loud sound and a very soft one. The instrument's range increased as well. Mozart's 5-octave piano of the 1780s had grown to an 8-octave one a century later. Foot pedals were also added in the 19th century. On the right side was the sustaining pedal, which enabled strings to continue to sound after the performer had lifted his or her hand from the corresponding keys. On the left was the soft pedal, which softened the dynamic level by shifting the position of the hammers relative to the strings. Finally, in the 1850s, the Steinway Company of New York began cross-stringing the piano, overlaying the lowest-sounding strings across those of the middle register, and thereby producing a richer, more homogeneous sound. By the mid-19th century, all the essential features of the modern piano were in place. The essential design of the piano has not changed in 150 years. Download a supplementary listening guide for piano pieces by Robert and Clara Schumann at the text website. As the piano grew larger and more expressive, it became something of a home entertainment center, a place where the family could gather to play and sing before the days of television and electronic entertainment. Every aspiring middle-class home had to have a piano, both for family enjoyment and as a status symbol. The high art instrument in the parlor signified to visitors that they had entered a cultured home. Parents made sure their children, especially the girls, received lessons, and publishers, eager to profit from the vogue for the piano, turned out reams of sheet music for pianists of all skill levels. Spurred by the sudden popularity of the piano, a host of virtuoso performers descended upon the concert halls of Europe with fingers blazing. What they played was often more a display of technical fireworks, rapid octaves, racing chromatic scales, thundering chords, than of musical substance. Happily, however, several of the greatest piano virtuosos of the 19th century were also gifted composers. Frédéric Chopin. In the compositions of Frédéric Chopin, the piano and its music have their most perfect union. This poet of the piano, as he was called, was born near Warsaw, Poland, of a French father and a Polish mother. The father taught at an elite secondary school for the sons of Polish nobility, and it was there that Frédéric not only gained an excellent general education but acquired aristocratic friends and tastes as well. He then moved on to the newly founded Warsaw Conservatory, where, between 1826 and 1829, he concentrated on the study of piano and composition. During this period, he composed his first major work, a brilliant set of variations for piano and orchestra on Mozart's duet, La Ci darum la mano. From Don Giovanni. After this success, Warsaw seemed too small, too provincial, for a young man of Chopin's musical talents. So, in 1830, he departed to seek his fortune in Vienna and Paris. The next year, Poland's fight for independence was crushed by Russian troops. Chopin never returned to his homeland. Figure 25, 1. A superbly romantic portrait of Chopin by Eugene Delacroix. It was originally painted with Chopin next to George Sand. But in 1870, a vandal slashed the double portrait, thereby creating two canvases. Copyright Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. After an unsuccessful year in Vienna, the 21-year-old Chopin arrived in Paris in September 1831. His inaugural concerts caught Parisians' fancy, and his imaginative playing soon became the stuff of legend. But Chopin was not cut out for the life of the public virtuoso. He was introverted, physically slight, and somewhat sickly. Consequently, he chose to play at private musicales in the homes of the aristocracy and to give lessons for a fee only the very rich could afford. I have been introduced all around the highest circles, he said within a year of his arrival. I hobnob with ambassadors, princes, and ministers. I can't imagine what miracle is responsible for all this, since I really haven't done